Welcome back. In our previous lecture, we took a step back and asked what ethics is. We said that ethics is rational reflection on human conduct with the aim of directing that conduct in appropriate ways. We also laid out the three branches of ethics: descriptive ethics, normative ethics, and metaethics. Near the end of that lecture, we touched upon a topic that we didn't fully dive into. When we came to metaethics, we raised a question and then set it aside. We asked whether moral thought and talk is really relativistic, whether justice is something different for each person or for each society, rather than something objective and true for everyone. Today, we will take up that topic. We will focus on moral relativism. Before we go any further, it's worth quickly reminding ourselves of those three branches of ethics, because the whole lecture is going to hinge on keeping them straight. Descriptive ethics simply describes the ethical views that a given people hold at a given time. It tells us what is believed, not whether those beliefs are right or wrong. Normative ethics goes further and tries to give us concrete moral guidance. It tells us how we ought to live. And metaethics is the most abstract of the three. It steps back and asks the most foundational questions. Is there such a thing as moral truth at all? Is morality objective, or is it relative? Okay, so what is moral relativism? Moral relativism is the view that there is no such thing as a universal, objective, moral truth. A moral relativist believes that morals are different for different people and for different societies. Of course, this is not some fringe position. It is found everywhere. If you were to scroll through any social media feed or listen in on almost any casual conversation, you will hear it. You may hear people say things like, well, that's just good for you, or who's to say what's right, or again, that's just your morality, don't impose it on me. Now, what's interesting about moral relativism in our own day is that for many of us, it appears to be either obviously true or obviously false. There isn't much middle ground. Someone who supports moral relativism, for example, will point out that different people and cultures have their own moral or ethical codes. And that seems obviously right. But people who oppose moral relativism will also point out that there are moral acts that just seem wrong regardless of the circumstance. For example, it just seems obviously wrong for a soldier at war to assault and murder innocent civilians. So both those for and against moral relativism are pointing to something that seems obviously true. And that raises a question. How do we know who's right? Or is either party right? In order for us to answer the question, we have to assess what relativism is in more detail. And to do this, we will try to steelman it. We will consider why people, perhaps including you, the viewer, find moral relativism to be attractive. When we talk about moral relativism, we can be referring to at least two things. First, there is personal relativism. Personal relativism is the view that morality is relative to each individual person, so that what is right for me may not be right for you. And each of us is, in a sense, the measure of our own moral world. Now, if motion is relative, as Albert Einstein argued, then we might ask, why not morality as well? So that's personal relativism. Then there's also cultural or societal relativism. Cultural relativism is the view that morality is relative not to individuals, or at least not merely to individuals, but to whole societies, so that what is right in one culture may simply not be right in another. And so if we want to assess moral relativism then, we have to assess both cultural relativism and personal relativism. Let's begin with cultural relativism, because in some ways it's the easier of the two to see. Every culture and society has rules or laws. laws differ from place to place. In America, we are bound by American law. A person living in China is bound by Chinese law. Someone in ancient Rome was bound by Roman law. And this isn't an accident or a mistake. When I travel to another country, for example, I really am expected to live by its laws, and not the laws of my own country. So there does seem to be, at least on the surface, a genuine kind of relativism here. The rules I am bound by really do depend on where I am. But let's push this a little further, because the relativist is making a more serious point than it first appears. Why do we have laws at all? What is the purpose of law? Laws exist in order to hold a society together, to create order, to make cooperation possible, and finally, to maintain a unified society. That is true in America, that is true in China, and it was true in Rome. Now, here's the interesting move. If every society were aiming at exactly the same unity, you would expect them to have the exact same laws. But they don't. Their laws differ. And so it seems to follow that they must be aiming at different kinds of unity. Each society has its own particular vision of what holds it together and what it values. And if the unity is different, and the laws that express that unity are different, then it really does look as though the moral values underneath those laws are different too. That, in short, is the cultural relativist's case. The different kinds of laws in different societies are evidence that morality itself varies from culture to culture. Now let's turn to personal relativism. What makes personal relativism attractive grows right out of something we said in our very first lecture on ethics. We said that ethics has to be practical. Ethics is not a merely abstract subject. It is something lived out by us individuals. It is not lived out by, say, some abstract thing because we are not abstractions. Ethics is lived out by concrete, particular persons, by you and by me. And if ethics is something lived out by particular persons, then there has to be something in ethics that is particular to each of us. And since none of us are the same, for example, your life and your circumstances and your situation are not mine, it seems that ethics has to be relative to each of us as individuals. If morality is truly mine to live or yours to live, then how could morality not be relative? And this connects back to what we just said about culture. We as individuals are bound by the laws and the culture that we happen to live under. I have my culture, and you have your culture. We are not bound to the same exact things. Of course, there may be overlap, but different cultures aren't completely the same. The personal relativist takes note of this. He gathers up both observations, our individual differences and our different cultural settings, and draws a single conclusion. Morality is different for each different person. Overall, the relativist appears to notice something true. There are different cultures that have different norms, and ethics is practiced by us individuals who believe different things about morality. But despite this, there are at least two reasons why people are still suspicious of relativism. Let's start with cultural relativism. The cultural relativist says different laws bind different people. Fine. But let's ask a simple question. Is it okay for me to break the laws of the society I am in? There are two possible ways to answer this. We can either say, yes, it is okay for me to break the laws, or no, it is not okay for me to break them. Let's suppose I say yes, that it is okay for me to break them. Well, if that is true for me, then why should it not be true for anyone, anywhere? Breaking the law, in this view, becomes universally permissible. and therefore undermines relativism. But suppose I say no, that I should not break the laws, at least not the just ones. The moment I add that qualification, the just ones or the good laws, notice what I have done. I have appealed to a standard above the law. A law is not just or unjust, a law is just or unjust not because it is a law, but because there is a higher standard of justice by which I judge the law. That standard cannot itself be merely the product of the culture because I am using it to evaluate the culture. So the bare fact that laws differ does not prove that morality is relative. It only proves that laws differ. Behind the laws, I still need an understanding of what makes a law just. And that understanding points past the culture. This may start to sound a bit abstract, so let's go ahead and make it concrete. Suppose we are living in Nazi Germany. A Jew comes to the door in our home to hide from German persecution. What should I do? Should I call the German authorities to let them know that I have found a Jew? Or do I hide the Jew in my home? If I hide the Jew, then I am breaking German law. Under cultural relativism, I shouldn't break the laws of my culture. Under cultural relativism, I should actually tell the German authorities that a Jew came to my home. Even as an American, if I am a cultural relativist, I can't say things like slavery or the killing of innocent human beings is genuinely wrong. I can only say that it's wrong for me. If someone from a different culture does kill an innocent human being, who am I to judge? The reason why these absurd consequences follow is because there's a small mistake that the cultural relativists make that leads to big consequences. The relativist is doing excellent descriptive ethics. They have noticed correctly that different cultures and different individuals live by different moral codes. That's definitely true. But then they slide, often without noticing, from descriptive ethics into meta-ethics. They move from people believe different things to therefore there is no moral truth. And that move simply does not follow. Disagreement about a question does not show that the question has no answer. For example, people once disagreed about the shape of the Earth. Some thought that it was flat, while others thought that it was round. Does that mean that the Earth has no shape because people disagree? Of course not. So in short, the relativist takes the part, descriptive ethics, and treats it as if it were a whole. That is the root of the error. That is the root error, I should say. And we have to keep our eyes on that, because everything else grows out of that. Let's look at another concrete example, but this time with personal relativism. Suppose that I am your instructor, and I held the personal, moral view that I am entitled to play favorites when I grade. If I like you, you pass, and if I don't like you, you fail. Now, you might object, especially if you didn't receive the passing grade. You might say, well, that's not right. You should treat us all equally. On personal relativism, though, why should I? My own personal moral compass tells me otherwise. In fact, who are you to impose your morality on me? And if you want to protest further, what could you do? Well, you could go and tell the school. That's fine. But look carefully at what just happened. You did not appeal to truth. You appealed to a higher institutional power. You appealed to an authority that can, say, put me in check, because you, on your own, lack the power to do so. This reveals the hidden foundation of moral relativism. Under relativism, what ultimately decides whether something is moral is not whether it is actually good or actually wrong, because in this view, there is no actual good or wrong. Rather, what decides right and wrong is whether someone has enough power to enforce their preference. And if that is so, then relativism isn't really a theory of morality at all. It is a theory of power. Strip away the language, and what is left is simply this: might makes right. So where does this leave us then? I want to end carefully, because it would be easy to walk away with the wrong lesson, that relativists are simply foolish, and that the people in your life who talk this way, or maybe even you yourself, have not thought about anything. And that's not what I am saying, because that's not true. The relativist has seen something real, I should say. Ethics is personal. It is concretely lived out. It genuinely has to be taken up by each particular one of us in our own particular lives. The relativist rightly grabs hold of that truth and holds it tightly. The trouble is not that they have grasped something false. The trouble is that they have grasped a part and mistaken it for the whole. And this has consequences. When we make a small mistake at the very beginning, it does not stay small. It grows. A tiny error in your first step sends you further and further off course with every step after it. That is exactly what happens here. The relativist begins with what looks like a small, almost technical confusion, treating descriptive ethics, the mere fact that people disagree, as though it were metaethics, the question of what is actually true. That's a small slip at the start. But follow it all the way down, step by step, and where does it land? It lands you in the claim that all of morality is ultimately nothing but power, that there is no right and wrong. Morality becomes based on who is strong enough to enforce their will. So a small mistake at the beginning becomes a large one in the end. Of course, the task of philosophy is not to merely win an argument. As we have noted before, it is to be transformed. It is not enough for me to just talk about the strengths and weaknesses of relativism. You have to evaluate them yourself by asking the hard questions. If the relativist says something true, great. Hold on to it and live it out. And if he says something that is false, just discard it. And that goes with anything in philosophy. I say all this because there's a lot at stake, and I don't say that to just sound dramatic. We are already beings of action. Every day we are faced with ethical choices. So the question is not, am I going to practice ethics? We already are. The question is, am I going to do so with intentionality? That's ultimately going to be the difference between someone just going with the flow of life and actually swimming through it. There's only one animal that I know of that goes with the flow: dead fish. But we aren't dead fish. We are human beings. The most dignifying thing that we can do for ourselves is to live in accordance with what makes us most human, which is what I hope we discover throughout this course. I hope this was helpful. Thank you.